Ladies and gentlemen, I have the complete delight and thrill of speaking with the one and only Cadell Last, who I always enjoy speaking with, who I've learned so much from over the years, whose work on Lacan, Hegel, Žižek, Zupančič, I can keep going, is just absolutely fantastic. And Cadell will be teaching on the philosophy of right by the one and only Hegel. And we are here today to speak about that. And I thought I would just first start just asking you about the book in general, Cadell, what you've been thinking, and then also just the topic of reason and politics in general, which is so interesting, and I think we need to think desperately today. So, Cadell, thank you for being here. It's always a delight to speak with you.
Yeah, fantastic to be here. And it's a little bit of a tradition that whenever I do a course at Philosophy Portal, I want to have a discussion on O.G. Rose. I think it's a great place to both clarify for myself why I'm teaching the book, maybe get some ideas about how I want to approach teaching the book. And of course, anyone who's interested in O.G. Rose's work, I hope will also be interested in the work at Philosophy Portal. Towards that end, why teach the philosophy of right? What's going on here? I just want to emphasize that at Philosophy Portal, the courses that were unfolding and the progression of the courses were unfolding, and the logic of the courses were unfolding is not random. There is a higher order logic to the courses that we're trying to develop. And hopefully that's in service of not only the intellectual community that I think is emerging at Philosophy Portal, but also in service to the intellectual moment that we find ourselves in, not just on the liminal web, but broadly speaking. And I suppose the most important milestone that the philosophy of right represents in the history of Philosophy Portal is it's the first text that really approaches politics head on. And I think that that's really important because you can spend your entire life studying philosophy, and you can spend your entire life being spiritually inquisitive, in even an interdisciplinary and a holistic perspective, without ever really taking seriously the issues of politics. Let alone the issues of politics in the context of the modern world. And I think that the main focus for me with the philosophy of right is really taking the state as a philosophical entity. What is the state? And I think that this, just broadly speaking, independent of what Hegel's talking about the state, is a mega issue today. In my lifetime, I've seen the erosion of representative democracy. I've seen the erosion of faith in the entire democratic process. I've seen the erosion of conventional ideas around the relationship between capitalism and democratic socialism. I remember growing up, there was reason to believe that there was some sort of political progress going on towards something that looked like democratic socialism. And now I think that that's just basically an untenable position in some sense, or an unlikely position in some sense. I see us, as you know, I see us much more drifting towards a situation of something that looks kind of like techno-feudalism. And I see our intellectual efforts online not only as potentially a symptom of that condition, but also potentially, if we approach that lack, right, um, uh, working towards an intellectual resolution of that situation. And so I see the work not only in the course on the philosophy of right, but also hopefully the extra post-course work we're going to be doing with the philosophy right as hopefully addressing some of these major political tensions and antagonisms today, which of course which of course can't be reduced to just Hegel's own thought in the context of situations like techno-feudalism. Hegel is not analyzing necessarily the contents of the 21st century in the way that we might have to analyze the contents of the 21st century. But I think that he provides, as always, a indispensable dialectical method, which will allow us to think through the relationship between the individual and the state. And just before handing it back to you, what's at stake in that dialectic between the individual and the state, I think is paramount, because there are a lot of political movements that, and on the left and the right, that see the state as an antagonism to the individual and freedom. And I think the stakes of Hegel and the philosophy of right, not dissimilar to the logic that I see in Daniel Tutt's work on the family, is trying to get us to a space where the family and the state are seen as crucial for our freedom, as opposed to an antagonism with our freedom. So hopefully those are things that we'll be able to explore, discuss, talk about throughout the nature of the course, and as well as develop our own ideas in relationship to this book and this text in the post-course process.
Outstanding. First off, I think it's a magnificent tradition to come to OG Rose whenever there's a new course at Philosophy Portal. It's one of my favorites, so I'm glad to continue with that tradition. Second, I think the tendency of intellectuals, philosophers, or the like to ignore politics leads to a fragility that eventually comes out, and when it comes out, it destroys the entire project, or it leads to pathologies, or it leads to unintended consequences. If you ignore politics, I'm not saying your philosophy or thinking has no value. I'm not saying that it is irrelevant, but there's something about the political question that is the test. It really is kind of the test, in the same way that we were speaking on kind of how the scientist has a hypothesis. Well, then you go through the experimentation to see if it can be a working theory, because theory and hypothesis are not similes, right? Without considering the political question, without considering the economic question, the philosophy doesn't go through the experimentation needed to move it to theory, to something to work on. And then what ends up happening is philosophy is just a realm, or theology is just a realm, or thinking is just a realm filled with an endless multiplicity of hypotheses, possibilities, working, and maybe the hypotheses are true. Just because it's a hypothesis doesn't mean it isn't true, but without the test, it can't move into a theory. And I think by really bringing to forefront, well, I mean, no one likes, if you have a hypothesis that you've been working on for years and years and years, and you've poured hundreds of hours into it, no one likes to put that through an experiment. No one enjoys the testing and the negativity that comes through thinking it in terms of the real of the experiment. But if you don't, then it never works into the realm of theory. And it can't be something that can actually be something other people can work on. Because what is, I always like what Jonathan Rout said in his incredible book, The Kindly Inquisitors, where he says the whole idea of the scientific method, because in a sense, this is kind of the political method that philosophy needs, the economic, like this kind of method it needs to go through. But he said the key to a scientific experiment is that it is the results that no one in particular would have gotten. Like anyone could have been in the lab, and if they would have done, regardless the subject, and if they would have done the same experiment, it would have given you the same results, right? Now, this becomes more difficult when we start thinking the science of subject and all of those. But if we're looking at the ground level, the kind of notion of the experiment is that it is not contingent upon the individual. There's a universality in it, even if the hypothesis required a individual person to come up with, right? And that's where you move, like we talked about the universal singularity, like you're moving to this place, but you need the experiment to determine if there's any possibility of something more universal in that singularity, right? Well, philosophy without the experiment of politics or economics, because I'll talk about political economy, you can never know if your philosophy is simply for you. You can never know if it's beyond just you and people like you, right? Because it's then still just a hypothesis that might be for people in particular. Whereas Jonathan Rauch's point is the experiment shows what anyone would have gotten had they been in the laboratory that day. The particular differences of those person, not so much. And so basically, if we want to talk about philosophy, if we believe that philosophy has some reality, that it matters, that there's really a big deal going on, if we don't think the political, why should we ever think that we're dealing with anything more than hypotheses? Why should we ever think that we're working with actual theory, per se, that people can then operate in? And there can be disagreements. There can be different, people can present new hypotheses on how things should operate and be done. But if we can't think the real, like I know we've talked a lot and, on intimate relationships, if philosophy can't think sexuality, intimate relationships, economics, politics, then it's in the realm of hypothesis. And hypothesis can be interesting. Hypothesis can have practical benefits to people, but without politics, then there's no reason to think we're dealing with a theory that we can work with. And so for me, bringing it to the political, I'll give it to you on just any response to what I just said. But to me, if you don't bring it to the political, you're per se in the realm of hypothesis. You're not really working yet to the realm of theory.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that, both in relationship to my background as a thinker and in relationship to Hegel's project as a whole, I think it's actually a blessing for me that I started my intellectual journey in science. I almost want to say, because I didn't study philosophy in my 20s even. I just started in science, and the benefit of that was getting accustomed to understanding how the scientific method worked, and how you test a hypothesis, basically. And how you test a hypothesis in such a way is that you're moving from the singular to the universal. Just to sort of make a connection with some of the things that you were saying is important for a philosophy of politics. And I think that it's difficult for people who get into either philosophy or theology in their 20s to understand on some level that their philosophy or their theology is radically particular, meaning it's for them and for people like them, as opposed to struggling through the negativities required and demanded by universality. And I think so in that sense, I feel like it's my scientific training in my 20s was a blessing, and then allowed me to come into philosophy at a moment where I could no longer refuse that I needed philosophy. So in other words, when I came into philosophy, it wasn't necessarily even out of an attraction for philosophy itself. I wasn't fetishizing philosophy in some sense. It was that I could no longer deny that I needed to learn this. It was out of a necessity. And I think even saying that goes too far, because it wasn't even that I needed philosophy. It was that I needed a specific kind of philosophy. And that specific kind of philosophy in retrospect is when I would call it a dialectical philosophy. So now going deeper into some of the things that you were saying, what is the distinction between, let's say, material science, as I was sort of educated, and the type of science and philosophy that Hegel's developing? Because he does call it a science.
Yeah.
He calls it a philosophical science, and he calls it a science of right. So in the phenomenology of spirit, what we're basically doing is a science of experience. It's a phenomenological testing. As you'll often say, it's a phenomenological journey. You're in some sense testing the experience. You're testing the experience of negativity and deriving a positive result in what Hegel will call absolute knowing. In the science of logic, you're doing a science of concept, and you're deriving the negativities of the concept towards what Hegel will see as a positive result in the absolute idea. And what's going on in the philosophy of right is you're doing a science of right, science of politics, where Hegel's claiming that you can derive a positive result in the idea of absolute freedom. The further we go into what the nature of this absolute freedom is, however, the more we'll see that if we don't take up the challenge, in the same way that if we don't take up the challenge of the science of experience, we might run into the reification of a certain phenomenological model. In the same way that if we don't do a science of concept, we might end up in the reification of a certain logical system. If we don't do the science of right, we might end up in the reification of a certain political organization, which leads to basically the threat of total catastrophe in the sense of geopolitical tensions, in the sense of geopolitical. And so you can see how in this movement at Philosophy Portal of going through the logic of Hegel's works from the science of experience to the science of concept to the science of right, we're in some sense moving from the singular to the universal on the level of, we have to think through universal geopolitical tensions. And if we don't think through universal geopolitical tensions, then we are going to be in a situation where we might enter a state of self-annihilation, as became a real threat and a real possibility in the 20th century, and is no more. It is no less of a threat now in the 21st century. Now, one more thing before throwing it back to you is that in some sense, what Hegel's trying to do in his Science of Right is try to demonstrate internal to the concept itself the logical stages which need to unfold in order for there to be some semblance of, dare I say, harmony, or say positive interrelationship between different state actors. And the basic logic at work there I find quite helpful, which is first this sort of zero-level tension between the immediate will and social morality. And from this tension between immediate will and social morality derives the categories which Hegel seems to suggest are necessary of family, community, state, and interrelations between states. And so what that means basically is that if we conceive of our freedom on the one hand as an immediate will, like what I immediately want now, Hegel would see this as extraordinarily particular and abstract. However, basically he would say that's a childish conception of freedom. He calls it caprice, right? If we just, sort of whatever I want in the moment is how I conceive of freedom. Hegel has no room in his system for this notion of freedom. He would see this as unfreedom. What Hegel conceives of as freedom is something that's able to work with, as a dialectical process, social morality or the resistances of the world. I think what you refer to in your work as the moral real. From there, deriving the necessity of family, he does not when I say family, I don't mean we have to think of the family as some sort of heteronormativity, but some sort of social structure which is reproducing the species. And Hegel says explicitly, is as the need that the human being has for sexual love, which is the unity between sexuality and love, not sort of, let's say, bypassing sexuality, pretending it's not important, or just, let's say, expressing sexuality in an unconstrained way, as if you can love and just sort of, say, express your sexuality as like some pure immediate multiplicity. From there, the family to the community, here talking on the level of civic community, and then on the level of state and the interrelations between states. And what I just want to say as a final thought there, which I think is a mega philosophical issue for us to think through, is that Hegel doesn't seem to be proposing that there's a higher organization above the state which unifies the states in some sort of, let's say, global entity, some global state. That's not what he's proposing, it doesn't seem to me. But at the same time, it seems like a lot of post-Hegelian thinking does offer itself up to this temptation of, isn't there a world organization of some kind? And so this is an open question to me. I think that when we think interrelations between states, I'm thinking here what we've been able to do in the 20th century to precisely defend against world war is establish. At first, we tried to establish some sort of League of Nations. Then we tried to establish something like the United Nations. And there's various different forms of international organizations that are forming between different states. Even something like the European Union, as an entity above states, which is trying to mediate the differences between European states. I think these are big, obviously open questions, but hopefully Hegel's dialectic would give us a chance to rethink some of these distinctions, because I think there's, again, mega geopolitical tensions erupting, and I think what everyone seems to share on some level is a recognition that the neoliberal political model is, at best, not working well, and at worst, undermining our conditions of possibility for morality, family, community, and state recognition. So I'll leave that there.
Magnificent. First, I was going to comment on that feeling you have of kind of being blessed to have started in science and never taking a philosophy class. I actually feel quite similar. I always loved economics, and I always read a lot of philosophers, like thinkers like a David Hume, And different people are like, philosophy actually causes unembeddedness, loss of common life, philosophical melancholia, and then mainly like Philip Reeve, Peter Berger, all the sociologists. But then the day came where it's like, oh no, we actually have to do philosophy. Like you were kind of forced into it. Like I talked in, as we in the Science of Logic course, the move from Hume to Hegel. Because you say, I would have stayed in Hume all day long if I could have, because the counter-enlightenment, Vico, all of these different people with economics, Hayek, kind of this restriction of the immediate, the particular in philosophy as the concept just leads to totalization that then leads to totalitarianism. It was like, makes sense. But then it was like, oh, wait, without philosophy, we have no self-defense. We have to figure out neoliberalism is leading to a return of these very strongmen movements. There were a lot of pathologies that were developing. And then I found myself having to interact with people in my common life who were quite different. And how do you mediate that differences, right? And so philosophy became, in a way, like you said, necessary. You found yourself negated to it, right? Found yourself in it. And I think that's really important, because then your disposition to philosophy is not one of, oh, this is nifty, but one of, oh gosh, like something depends on this. Something really important depends on this. And that's a very different orientation. And to me, that makes me think of the philosophy, right? One of the things I've always gotten from it, and I'd be curious how you respond to this, is that there's a way in which Hegel is suggesting he wants you to go, hey, if it exists, there's a reason it exists. And so philosophy should think what exists, not what could have been or could be. And to me, a way I've thought about it is that whereas Rousseau and Hobbes are talking about the state of nature in the past as a kind of axiomatic grounding of how the world should be, Hegel's like, no, the state of nature is the state of now, per se. The way the world is now is what should be the basis of our political order. And to me, that's quite profound, because if you don't assume that, like, because that's a starting position, if you will, you could theoretically spend your entire life thinking of a system alternative to, say, democracy, or a system alternative to capitalism, or a system alternative to the family, or a system alternative to X, Y, and whatever, right? And Hegel's like, sure, maybe there's reformation, maybe there's things that need to be changed, but you need to assume that if it exists for a reason, because the guiding principle of history is the right. And, in a way also to think about that is like, if in the same way in my own personal life, I was, in a sense, forced into philosophy. Likewise, you're talking from science forced into philosophy. There's a way in which Hegel is saying that's actually how history works. You're forced into family. You're forced into ethics and contract. You're forced into the nation state. Like, all you have to do is look back and assume that the people created the things that define now because they were forced into doing so. The contradiction, if you will, arose, and it had to be addressed. And if you believe that, and make that the basis of your political philosophy and of your philosophy in general, it is very, very different than a philosophy that's saying we made a wrong turn. We made a wrong turn and should have done something different, because then you have to tarry with the negative. You have to tarry with what is and say, okay, maybe neoliberalism today is problematic. Maybe there is some contradiction that has not been addressed, that is trying to find negation sublation, that is trying to emerge, but then it is finding itself in the process of what I'll call self-effacement, because we might just have nuclear annihilation because we're not able to integrate with that process of the contradiction. We're not ready for it. We as subjects are overwhelmed by it, right? Well, the very anxiety that emerges, here's the thing, this is why I really like the philosophy of right and what's doing. Moments of historic transformation, or when a contradiction is becoming, like in the freak theory with the great, our beloved Alex Ebert on this notion of the threshold, history arrives at these kind of saturation points where the contradiction is, you can't ignore it anymore, right? When you feel the anxiety of that, the natural temptation is to say, oh, we did something wrong in the past. We need to go back, right? Or, well, we need to just throw out everything and make a better future, right? And what Hegel's like, no, you have to stay in the now. In a way, he locks the door behind you. He's like, no, the state of now, like the state exists. You must think this. And to me, that also keeps philosophy from just being an endless deconstruction into nothing, right? Because you could always undermine the family, always deconstruct the contract, always deconstruct capitalism. Philosophy, and this is what David Hume was so good on, and then I'll give it back to you. David Hume understands that philosophy can always question anything forever. And because of that, you can always be unembedded, always deconstructed, or never commit to anything. Because you can always say, well, the family is, that's just a product of forces of hierarchy and capitalism, and it's evil or something. They say, well, the government's evil and they're all corrupt, so, whatever, right? You can always do that. Philosophy will give you the ability to always find reasons to not engage or to critique or to get rid of, right? And if you don't know that, then that's probably what you're going to do as a philosopher. You become basically the cynic, as kind of David Hume will talk about, right? Well, Hegel's like, no, because all philosophy that's questioning what is invalid. You can't do that. That philosophy doesn't count. You must assume the now. Philosophy has the starting assumption of philosophy has to be the now. And his basis for that is on the notion that history is a process of this working out of the right. The science of right is working through history. And if indeed the natural experience of human beings, no one from the ground level, and I'd be curious what you think about this, because an impression I get from Hegel is that no one thinks trying to be wrong. Like, you cannot try to be wrong. If you on a math sheet say 2 + 2 = 5, then you think it's right to, for some reason, write 5 there, right? You think that's what you ought to do. Oughtness guides human action, right? It's impossible to intentionally do what we think is wrong, right? And even if you do something self-destructive, you think it's right to be self-destructive. And the thesis is that the more you move toward the collective, the more and more the right is going to define action versus individual instances of self-destruction or being a jester or something, right? Now, that doesn't mean the jester can't have a lot of influence, but it is to say that because the human experience is naturally trying to be more correct than wrong, you times that by the collective, then there would be reason to think that this current historic moment is more of a product of people trying to be right than trying to be wrong. Now, maybe they are wrong, but you have to assume that they're right and be forced into seeing them as wrong. In the same way that we talked about being forced from economics into philosophy, forced from science into philosophy, there's something like you must start believing they are right. And if you're then forced by the contradiction into seeing they are wrong, well, then that's going to be from the certain humility that is necessary for thinking the politics. So to me, I see a lot in this, and I'll just be curious, any thoughts, that there's this real assumption that you must assume that this moment exists for a good reason. You must think this moment. And so this is the point. So if the nation state exists now, if economics exists now, if contracts exist now, if families exist now, then you should assume there's a reason they're there, and you should think them, not just critique them. And I think it's an interesting question on like the giant modern state, like there's this idea of, oh, there's going to be kind of a global unity or different things. I think the issue is that Hegel, there's just a kind of assumption the brain naturally totalizes. When sure, I don't think Hegel would say that's impossible, but it must be earned through the now, through the negativity of the now. And you can't just jump to that. It has to be worked through with what is now. Is there right now a single nation state? No. Okay, well then don't think it. Is there a UN? Yes. Okay, well let's think about the UN and let's look at the structure of it. The UN's more like a federation than it is a giant nation state or something, like a world state or anything, right? So so let's think, what is a federation? And I could keep going, but to me, the philosophy of right provides the basis of philosophy as a whole. Like it provides this basis of you must think now. And the journey of the concept must be based on now. The phenomenological journey must be based on now. And the reason I do think one of the reasons why most political philosophy has been so not good or contributed to problems is because they've not thought the now. They've not made their basis their now. They've made their basis a critique of the now versus we're going to assume the now until the now forces us to critique it. Like until it is like we're forced into the critique, not start in the critique. What are your, so those are, I think there's a big difference between being forced into the critique versus going in critiquing.
Yeah. So let's just start with, I think, what the zero level stakes are of the philosophy of right in the context of, let's say, the conventional philosophical relationship between Hegel and Marx. So the main distinction at work here, especially in relationship to what you're saying about political science, is the what is versus the what should, right? And the what is now, and the what should, let's say, is future oriented. What should be. And I think that what Hegel's trying to do here, and this I think complexifies the picture between Hegel and Marx, is that what Hegel's trying to do is he's trying to radically limit philosophy to the what is. And in that sense, I'm not saying that, there's no room for thinking about what should be in some level, but when it comes to let's say, the political economy of what should be, which seems to me to govern and start to orient Marxist philosophy, I guess I get the question of, it's not philosophy by Hegel's standard. It could be philosophy by a different standard, but that doesn't seem to be what Hegel's emphasizing should be the orientation of philosophy, which is, again, focusing on what is. So I think this has huge consequences for approaching what Hegel's striving for, which is a science of right, which is a science of politics, namely because when you're trained in science, you are trained, ideally, if you get a proper scientific education, what you're getting from that scientific education is you're being taught on how to be wrong. The problem with standard scientific education, however, is that it's not teaching you how to be wrong personally. It's teaching you how to be wrong in relationship to external substance. So you're running hypotheses and experiments, which in some sense you have some effective relationship to that topic, or you have some interest in the truth of, whether or not this external phenomena is behaving in this way or that way, or whether or not this theory is accounting for this phenomena or that phenomena. But it often does not have a direct relationship to, say, that scientist's family life. It doesn't have a direct relationship, say, to that scientist's political orientation, or it doesn't have a relationship to the dimensions of politics which Hegel is trying to approach in the science of right. And I even go so far as to say that Hegelianism is proposing, in some sense, that it is an alternative foundation for a spirit science in relationship to Newtonian science. Like, the big move that's at work in Hegel's work does have a consequence on that level. And when I analyze the discourse in contemporary scientific circles, I do think that we should bring Hegelianism at least into the conversation, because they're trying to work through what is the relationship of science and politics. What is the relationship between science and history? What is the relationship between science and subjectivity? What is the relationship between science in a classical mechanical paradigm versus a quantum mechanical paradigm? And going through Hegel's work systematically in the way that I have, at least, and also someone who's going through Hegel's work systematically as I have with someone who has a scientific background, I am led to the conclusion that Hegelianism is part of the solution to some of the issues that are being discussed in contemporary science about these issues. Now, in regards to what is and what should be on the level of politics, I had the experience teaching at the School of Thinking this year, where one of the students told me that there should be no borders because everyone should be able to move wherever they want, whenever they want. Right. And now, I'm just saying that as an example of a type of thinking which is more common than you'd think, of someone orienting their politics towards their image of what should be, which is not only diametrically opposed to what is, but seemingly a non-starter and an impossibility of a conversation about what is. So you can never really start thinking about politics if you're taking that stance. And so this type of training, in terms of training to focus on what is and how you might be wrong, as opposed to thinking about what should be, and my idea is the right idea. Like, just imagine, like, the radicality of that idea. There should be no borders and everyone should move however they want. And thinking that that's the right way, and thinking that that's the right way in an uncritical way. You don't think that there's any possible complications with that idea in its actuality? You don't think that there's anything in that idea that might lead to a catastrophic result, and that that the world might be radically more complex than your positive idea of what it should be? So again, I think that not only should we be thinking in such a way as that we should let's say, learn how to be wrong and testing in relationship to how to be wrong, but how to be wrong in a personal way. How to be wrong in a personal way on the level of what I immediately think is right, what I immediately think about the moral real at the moment, what I think about family or community or state or relations between states, what I think is probably not right. What I think is probably, to some degree, there might be little bits of pieces of correct thinking that I have, but probably a bunch is what I think is wrong. And to approach conversations about politics in that way, I think is super important, especially if one of two things here specifically about family and government. If you've never started a family and you think the family is just irrelevant to your freedom, but you've never tested it. Or if you've been burned by the family, right? Which means that you actually wanted the family, but now you're reacting against the family because it hurt you, right? In both of these situations, you might be skeptical of your own positive ideas about the family or your own positive ideas about the state, because either you don't have the adequate experience to test your ideas against the concept, or also that you might just be suffering from the unactualized ideal of that entity that you actually really wanted, but it just didn't work out the way that was ideal. So these types of things are hopefully what we can start to think in a better way, in some sense, against ourselves. And I think that on that level, and again back to the what is versus what should be, at least as a starting point, as an opening to Hegel's ideas, Hegel is a radical thinker of actuality, as opposed, not opposed to possibility, but just that possibility is, like, for Hegel, possibility is abstract. For Hegel, possibility is abstract, and there's a certain dialectical motion, of course, with the logic of the negation, which is at work, which is aiming towards concrete actuality. And explicitly in the philosophy of right, he'll give the metaphor of the child's will versus the adult's will. And the child's will versus the adult's will runs something along the lines of, let's say, the direct affirmation of the present moment, what he'll call impulse, right? So the child is impulsive. He'll also call this impulsive motion a closed circle. Towards the development of that child's will, which he sees as something like a line, a progressive line or a progressive ladder, pointing in a certain direction towards the maturation of the free will. And in some sense, Hegel's here saying that we're not born free. So, you know, like with Rousseau's idea, man is born free, but everywhere is in chains. Hegel's kind of saying, no, we're born in chains. We're born in chain to our impulse. We're born in chain to our natural will. And he'll say there's a contradiction of the natural will, that the natural will is good insofar as that it's immanent, but it's bad insofar that it's against spiritual freedom. And so has to be, in some sense, overcome and negated. And where we go from the child's will to the development of the child's will towards spiritual freedom in the adult is where Hegel will put the movement from the circle to the line to the circle of circles. And the circle of circles is basically what Hegel would call the infinite self-reference. And this is where we get, and now this makes me think of our conversations about your work, where actually it seems to me that the ground of politics for Hegel is this infinite self-reference in the mature individual, where that is actually our given. So our given is not some sort of traditional paradigm or structure, but the given is this capacity to cultivate a world of adults who have this infinite self-reference, and then the scaling of that infinite self-reference. So again, to link it to the major problems that you're working through in Belonging Again, And he gives us basically the dialectical notion of what that scaling looks like. It goes from the individual infinite self-reference to the capacity to scale that in family, to the capacity to scale that in community, to the capacity to scale that on the level of the state, and then in the interrelations between states. So I'll send that back to you.
Magnificent, absolutely magnificent. I love this idea of a science that teaches us to personally be wrong. I think that's really well put and beautiful. So there's a few things that come to mind. I think it's exactly right. At the end of the day, it's some given of the capacity to reference oneself in a manner that is able to find fittedness in what is, and finds an oughtness in that isness that they're fitted with, the circle and the circle. Because something that's very interesting to me, when the philosophy of right kind of starts with, I believe, in the Cambridge translation that I had on this idea of the abstract freedom. You start in this abstract freedom that has to work to this absolute freedom. And the abstract freedom is a notion that the moment you're born, it feels like you ought to be able to do whatever you want. It feels like you just ought to be. You shouldn't have to walk. You should just be where you want to be. You shouldn't have to eat. You should just have energy. You find yourself immediately confronting determination that is in conflict with your inner source of an abstract freedom. And to me, so much of the question of the state is how do we make people live with that without becoming pathological, identify with determination? Because the key move is the abstract freedom and coming in conflict with what is. You naturally start off with ought and is in conflict, actually. Ought and is are in conflict. And Hegel suggests that a mature subject would find oughtness in what is. What is ought to be. And that's the only way to have absolute freedom. You can't have absolute freedom unless you identify with what is. And the state, the role of the state is to help convince you or to make you feel as if you ought to find oughtness in what is. Because the state is legitimate. The state has had a function that has helped you actually not spend your entire life hungry. It has helped you relate to other people. So the state of now is contributing to the capacity of the human being to believe that what ought to be is what is. Because that's the supreme. In a sense, the utopian vision of the state is the ability for people to ought to have what is. Because if you right now were to say what is what ought to be, well, then it's in a sense utopia, right? In a kind of playful way, although that's a dangerous word. But if you go, what is ought to be, well, then you have paradise in a way. You have everything. So what would it look like for the state to function to help the citizens feel that what is ought to be, knowing darn well that they all start with an abstract freedom that's in conflict with isness? So you're starting right there with a contradiction that the state is in business of working into a maturity and then helping people scale that. Right? And then the thing is, if isness equals oughtness, then all you ought to do is reference yourself in what is. Like automatically the self-reference is the ought act. And right finds that self-reference in the circle of the circle, and that is freedom. Because here's the thing. If what is what you believe ought to be, you're free. Because you're free in. Isaiah Berlin talks about negative and positive freedom. And he talks about freedom from and freedom to, like you're free from something, but then you're also free to. What you see in Hegel, and I mentioned this but I've mentioned this before with Keith, with Ken, Mr. Lowy, is the notion that there's also a freedom in or freedom with. Like when ought and is are together, you find freedom in what is. You find freedom in yourself because there's nothing else you want, right? You want what is, right? But you see, the automatic problem that we have is how do you find a desire to want what is if it's imperfect, if it's finite, if there's suffering? How can you want suffering? That seems to make no sense, right? How can you want finitude? That seems to make no sense. So the state automatically has a problem, in a sense. Like society has a problem, if you write. Like freedom is only ultimately possible in a sustainable manner if people find freedom in, where is and ought are two sides of the same coin. But naturally, all human beings start with their abstract freedom in conflict of determination. The feeling that I should be able to do anything is in conflict with the fact that you can't do anything. And there's also a danger where everyone has different ideas of how to resolve that tension, right? And they have their big ideas by which to actually bring about oughtness. So you have to manage all that. And you have to do it in a way that also respects difference. Well, what the frick? But now there's a hope, because the funny thing is, actually the possibility of finding oughtness and isness, there's no reason why that can't be pluralistic, because there could be many is, that each person in their own subject finds an oughtness in that isness that is their own, but there is still a universality in it because we all share the same facticity. We all share the same world, really, like the same now, right? And so what you're doing, I think what Hegel is doing, like you say, this radical thinking of the actual, he's saying what we need to make the basis of shared universality is not an idea, but we need to make it the actual, that then because we all relate to our isness as oughtness, the difference that everyone has in pluralism can get along because that difference ought to be there. The negativity they experience ought to be there. When you encounter negativity, you're tempted to think this is evidence that the world is wrong. That's your natural tendency. When your abstract freedom encounters determination, your natural interpretation is to say this shouldn't be. But if instead you said, no, negativity should be, because what is should be, right? Until you are forced by that negativity to do otherwise. There is a reformation mechanism. So, for example, if you're in the now and you're being invaded by a rebel army, you're basically forced to say, this shouldn't be, by the situation, and thus you correct it, right? There are things that can happen in isness that then must be addressed with reform, but the key is that what Hegel is saying is let it arise in the isness until it forces you into correction and reform, versus look at it, say, this sucks, I'm going to reform it. Well, then you're probably just, if you're not forced into reforming the is, it's probably from your own inability to integrate with lack. That's the key. Like if you're not pushed into reform, then it's probably just a symptom of your own psychological state or your own not doing the work of negativity, right? But if literally you cannot get water, if literally you don't have access to electricity, then the isness is forcing you into addressing it, right? And that's where Hegel is, like, for me, like economics forces you into philosophy, science forces you into philosophy. It's like, yes, of course, when the isness forces you into reform, go for it, but be very, 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 very careful to assume that you know when reform is needed, and even be skeptical when you think you're being forced into it. That's the other crazy thing. Like, it's like, even when you think, nah, we have to do it because of the meta crisis or something, right? Well, hold on. Are you sure? Well, this would be the science of this is what the science of fallibility. We don't know how to take the fact that we're fallible seriously. Like, that should be everything in education. Like, well, now schools should really, really be about this, the error, the mistake of the subject. Like, yeah, there is a day when reform is necessary, when isness is there. But are you sure? Are you really, really sure that today is here? And to really, like in science, there's the prioritization of being wrong, the falsification of a pauper. We haven't moved that to the subject. And I think basically what Hegel is saying is that until you have a society that does that, political philosophy is going to be difficult, because it's almost always going to be the place from a ideal that is trying to resolve the tension of the abstract freedom with determination that is not found in the determination, but against the determination. And that's when you're going to get all these pathologies. And then I know, like, intuition is big. One of the things that I think we see today is we tend to flip between, and then I'll give it back to you. We either have these abstract ideas that are not actual, that cannot be tested, but then the other side is the intuition, where you say, I feel that this is what we should do, and that can't be tested either. Like, both of those are ways to avoid this testing of the negativity that without, we are probably just going to be caught in a lifelong project of trying to free our abstract freedom from determination, making absolute freedom impossible. And it's just interesting because, like, absolute knowing has this kind of accepting and knowing of limitation as necessary for the process of knowing at all. Likewise, at the absolute freedom is the determinations are what make freedom possible, because the only real freedom is freedom in, where isness and ought are brought together, that there's a limitation that actually is the very grounds of freedom, because without that limitation, there would be nothing there for you to find freedom in. But then the state has to be in service of that and to think that, and then subjects have to be able to handle that. And it seems like we can use philosophy to escape that in this bad way, but we can also use intuition to escape that in this bad way. So I'll throw it back to you.
Well, there's a big question in Hegelian philosophy, which a few thinkers have brought to the surface, but to my knowledge, one of the most important is Dylan Schall's work. Dylan Schall, who had a great conversation with Dmitry Kroimans on actual spirit about the conservative Hegel, the reform Hegel, and the revolutionary Hegel. So there's three different, say, interpretations of Hegel's politics. And I think the question that's coming to my mind in response to what you're thinking through at the moment is the question, how negative is the present moment? How negative is the present moment right now? And because you'll have people like, for example, Steven Pinker, who will say, actually, things are better than ever. Things are fantastic right now. And there's a whole bunch of data and there's a whole bunch of statistics, globally speaking, in relationship to the past, which, I mean, you can make that argument. You can make that case that things are fantastic right now. You have also a number of thinkers who are saying the apocalypse is upon us, that we're in an apocalypse right now. So I'm saying that the whole spectrum is represented. There's people who think this is the best time ever. There are people who think we're at the end of the human species. It's all going to collapse in just any moment now. And the question is, how much of these views are a reflection of the subject presupposing them? Right? How much is this a reflection of that subject's history? How much is this a reflection of their experience with isness? How much is this a reflection on their reflective capacity to integrate isness and work with isness versus project the negative side of their limited being and their abstract freedom versus the concreteness of the world? I don't even think that there are research projects that we can conduct that really get to the bottom of this question. Again, the basic question, how negative is the present moment right now? But what's definitely being forwarded in Hegel's work is that we should be, and this is a weird, I want to emphasize how weird this is, because Hegel's seen as an idealist, right? When we think of idealist, right? But Hegel is really the philosopher that's against your big ideas. He thinks your big idea, he thinks you can only really start thinking once you overcome your big ideas. And I had this conversation recently with Tony of Wondine, where he was basically we're trying to get at the difference between the Platonic model versus the Hegelian model. Because in the Hegelian model, there is a certain positive value orientation towards the ideal that we should be almost functioning in relationship to as a law for our being. And I know you've referenced Platonic philosophy in relationship to the planetary orbits, like it's the ideal as a law of a process of fitting. And I think that what we find in Hegel's work is not the complete abolition of the ideal, but a orientation that is grounded in what is actuality and self-referencing negativity. And his claim is, if you combine what is with self-referencing negativity, that the ideal will emerge retroactively after the fact. And this is the crucial point. And more and more, and I want to say, I'm not just teaching this, like I try to live this. And the more I live this, the more I see what Hegel's trying to say is that if you focus on what is plus the self-referencing negativity, not only will the ideal emerge retroactively, but it will be better than what your big idea was. That's the crucial point. That not only, so like, because people think, oh, well, I have to let go of my big ideas. I have to let go of my big ideals. That's a catastrophe. That's horrible. But the great thing is that in the immediacy of the moment, it might feel horrible. In the immediacy of the moment, it might feel like the world is ending. It might feel like an apocalypse. But actually, the ideal that can emerge usually far surpasses the grandeur and the beauty and the possibility of what your actually quite particular idea was. I can give some concrete examples of how that's emerged in my own life, but I'll just say that what I've learned, without going into the particular details, is that the reason the ideal seems to be better than what your particular idea is because it's the result of the idea as such. Meaning it's the result of the idea on the level of intersubjective historicity. It's by definition not something that can be thought by any one singularity. And at the same time, it's the result of moving through all singularities. So the idea is what becomes universal in its movement through our singularities, but it only can come through if we let it come through, which is, again, this what is plus the self-referencing negativity, which is the self-criticism, self-skepticism, the disposition of being wrong, and so forth. So in that very concrete way, it's not just hyperbole or just a fancy-sounding theological phrase if I say something like, God needs us just as much as we need God. Like if here we're talking about the ideal as God, in the sense of that our ideas of God are wrong, and God will come through, if you let me use that word, if we relate to what is in the correct disposition, or in this philosophical disposition that Hegel's trying to teach us, not just in a materialist science way, but in a political science way, which is, of course, we could think of as a different type, as a social material, as a social historical material. Now, a few more things I wanted to say is Hegel gives some very good points in the opening of the Philosophy of Right as what we could say as the disposition in politics of let's throw everything out. Let's throw everything. So these extremes of wanting to throw everything out or wanting to go back to an old ideal. The idea of wanting to throw everything out, he calls that will without thought. So it's just a destructive revolutionary burst. And we see that in, I think, both extreme left-right dispositions of we just need to, maybe more on the left than the right, we want to just throw everything out. We want to have a revolution of everyday life. We want to have a revolution of everything. The wanting to go back to an old ideal, he calls thought without will. And this would maybe be more seen as the romantic utopianization of the past, like "Make America Great Again" is a slogan that probably encapsulates a little bit of this. It's thinking without connected to the will. Hegel gives the examples in Philosophy of Right of the French Revolution as the will without thought. And he gives the example actually of the Brahmin class in Hinduism as the thought without will. So that's two interesting things to think through. And he basically is claiming that both of these extremes are unable to see self-limitation as positive. And he quotes Goethe saying that basically we cannot be great on the level of singular universality. So if we're talking about greatness of the individual for Hegel and Goethe is coming about through self-limitation. And seeing self-limitation as positive on the level of the abstract freedom being unlimited, and this process of self-limitation leading to an ideal which you can't anticipate ahead of time. Hegel didn't know what Hegel would be. Goethe didn't know who Goethe would be, right? Just like Nietzsche didn't know who Nietzsche would be, right? And all these things. And then maybe a few more final thoughts is that this disposition, I think, is so important, like in our contemporary political landscape, I think, especially when we're thinking about sexual freedom, because we had the sexual freedom revolution of the 1960s, but now it seems like all people want to do with sexual freedom is just be ungrateful for what is. And what I mean by being ungrateful for what is to reconcile with their own lack and their own limitation on the level of sexuality itself. And this is leading to very concrete results, which is demanding that the state, crucial word, demanding that the state allow us to, for example, just change our genders at any way we want, or just stopping puberty altogether, the puberty blockers thing, right? So like this is a radical disposition towards what is, and imposing an ought on what is, and trying to get the state to do it, and seeing the state of things as in radical antagonism with my abstract personal freedom to just change my body or all of these. So I'm just saying that this has very concrete. You might think, okay, well, this is leading to a very conservative philosophy, but I think actually it's leading, like, if we really take this seriously, there's huge emancipatory possibilities within this seemingly conservative disposition, in the sense of reconciliation with lack and limit leading to an ideal which will transcend our own personal immediate caprice, to use Hegel's term. And then, just before sending it back to you, I'll also say that for Hegel, this reconciliation with lack, this reconciliation with limit is, and to your question of how can we want to reconcile ourselves with imperfection and suffering and evil? How can we want to reconcile with that? And I think that the reason we should want to reconcile with that is because if the world was perfect, if the world had no suffering, if the world had no evil, then there would be no space for the infinite self-reference. The space for the infinite self-reference, which is the gift, and as you say in your work, which can be made into a gift, right? So the infinite self-reference is both the gift and what can be made into a gift. That's not possible without imperfection, suffering, and evil. And so it's like it's a gift and a curse. It's a gift and a curse. And the way Hegel expresses this gift and curse is it's the rose and the cross of the present, which I think is a very beautiful phrase.
Magnificent. Well, just on that last thing, I mean, basically the only ideals that exist are suffering ideals. So if there's no suffering, there's no ideals. The only beauty that exists is bleeding beauty. So if there's no blood, there's no beauty. And basically the only God that exists is one that can reduce you to ass, one that can terrify you, one that's a horror, if one does not rise to its occasion. So a perfect world would be one without perfection. An imperfect one would be without ideals. And so suffering is exactly the characteristics of wonder. Like when people talk about beauty, they piercing, suffering, love, like the greatest things in life are a mixture of the overwhelmingly good and the difficult. So if you have no difficulty, you cannot have these AB phenomenon per se. You cannot have these things that have a doubleness, that in that doubleness are precisely the ideal or the Platonic or the, like, this is the key. But this is also why the ideal can only be actual. It is literally not possible to think of beauty that simultaneously pierces you and is all. You can only receive it. Like you cannot think a love that is painful in its presence. Like you can't, because the emotion that is only possible of observing a beauty that you know that is good and beautiful while simultaneously it overwhelms you. That A-B-ness, that bothness is only possible in the actual. You cannot think it, nor can you feel it. Emotion in the abstract and thought in the abstract is incapable of the most sophisticated, nuanced experiences, like beauty, like love, like the ideal, which is a mixture of the good and the bad. You can't reduce it to one-sidedness. The things that humans find the most meaningful are not reducible to one-sidedness, but it is only possible in a way to think one-sidedness, because even if you think reason versus understanding, it's still in the mind. It's not the experience of the relationship. It's not the experience of negativity. So you literally cannot have ideals that don't bleed. You literally cannot have beauty that is not piercing, right? And so if we want to talk, I think that's what Hegel understands. Hegel's like, what he understands is that the only possibility of the Platonic is in the now. The Platonic is only possible in the cut, in the immediate, in the reduction of your good ideas. Your good ideas are what keep you from the good idea, per se. Your good ideas are what keep you from the absolute idea, right? And so
that's exactly.
Yeah. And so, but that realization is only possible in the now because it has to be experienced. It can't be thought. It can't be felt. It has to be thought felt experience. Bam, 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 bam. Because like right now, you are feeling, experience, and thinking all at once, right? only in the now, in the concrete, is that triplex, if you will, and there's more going on, but that triplex is possible only in the now, right? You cannot put it in the future and you cannot put it in the past. Well, that triplex is the only state that can receive the beautiful, the ideal, the God, the highest, the love, because that is the state that is able to take the negativity that comes with beauty and all of those different things. So it is only in the now that the Platonic or the God or the ideal is possible. And otherwise, to this idea that God needs man and man needs God, like otherwise God would be an abstraction, right? Like God needs, man in order not to be this abstraction that is incapable of the triplex. There's a real way, like there's some, like I think there's a part in Dante where it says, God made man to hear I am said back to him, right? Like it wouldn't be possible for God to hear I am said back to him unless man exists, right? Well, likewise, there's no possibility of God being this triplex of experience, which is the highest form of experience unless there's finitude, right? Likewise, there's no possibility of the ideal being absolute unless there's this triplex. There's no possibility of beauty being beauty versus just pretty without this triplex, but this triplex is now infinite. It's suffering. It is limited. Without it, you cannot have these things. And so Hegel is saying, so what would it look like for the state to defend that? What would it look like for the state to create a space in which that triplex can be experienced? Well, the state has to leave you to suffer your negativity. The state has to secure a space to make sure that you can face negativity. Whoa, no. The state exists in order to realize my abstract freedom. No. But Hegel also identifies that it's easy for the state to be put in business of that because we all start with an abstract freedom that's in conflict with our determination. So it's very natural to then think that the state should exist to help my abstract freedom be free. But then the state is in the business of either will without thought or thought without will, right? It's always the only way to get, well, let's put it this way. The only way to will your thought and to think your will is in the now. The state is to make you will your thinking. What you think, you're supposed to will it, which means you have to work your will to think, but then you should think your will. And what is your will? Your will is, I don't feel like I should be limited by my determination. And you're supposed to go, why do I feel that way? What would that mean? What should the state look like from the starting place of abstract freedom in conflict with determination? So you think the fact that you have a will, not bracket it out, and make that initial contradiction the basis of political life. That there's an abstract freedom that feels like it should be free from determination, but if it was free from determination, there would be no possibility of the triplex that makes possible beauty, ideals, and all of the thing that we are describing. The very fact that abstract freedom exists in a contradiction with determinism is what determination is why a triplex exists. And yet we naturally, in one-sidedness, get the state in the business of freeing us from the possibility of that triplex, which is ironically then self-effacing. And so to me also too, it's kind of funny because there's a few more thoughts and then I'll give it back to you. It's almost like in Hegel, he wants us to move from materialism to social materialism, social material. Like what is the material of social life or communal life? What is the material that arises? And that is triplex. I just keep saying triplex. That's the way. It's like this triplex materialism that is only possible in the now, where all of these things come together. That then what's interesting about that is it's as if the human is best in a certain kind of receiving. You're supposed to be in a receiving mode. Receive the is as ought, and you're receiving the ought. But here's the great tension. The very reason we're not in a receiving disposition to receive the beauty, to receive negativity, to receive suffering that all comes from us, the reason we're not in that disposition is precisely ourselves. This is the problem. We ourselves are what get in the way of receiving negativity to work us toward the beautiful. I'll just say the beautiful, right? Well, that's a problem because we are the obstacle. I know the Stoics say the obstacle is the way. Well, guess what? That means we're the way. Well, that's effed up because we're an obstacle then. We are the obstacle. Right? We are the obstacle and the way. And why? And then this is the other thing that Hegel understands. Where would the thought ever even come from that you shouldn't give into your abstract freedom? Like if you're born feeling that you should be free from your determination, why would you ever think otherwise? Because that's your natural experience, right? Well, this is why you need the community. This is why you need the state, because yes, we know you're born and your natural birth starting point is that you should be free of determination. But the state is actually here to teach you and to help you learn that those determinations are what make possible the triplex. Those determinations are what make possible freedom in. And the community, without a community, you would never have that thought. Like, you would just not have that thought. Where would that thought come from? Like, why would you not give in to your impulses? Why would you not give in to your instincts, right? Isn't that what, like, wolf boys do or different things, right? Like, so this is the problem. What do you do? Like, the horror, like, the problem you have today is you have communities that don't teach you the alternative idea. You have communities that say, absolutely, you should give in to your abstract freedom. Absolutely, what you think ought to be should be. Like you were mentioning people getting new genders. Well, it's like people like the state should be a theocracy. Everyone should be Christian. Everyone should be whatever I feel should be the case should be what everyone is, because people would be more free if they were just able to find Christ or something like that, right? Likewise, you say everyone would be more free if the state just allowed people to have the genders they want to have. Well, but everyone has to make individual choices their own way. But the key premise lurking under all of that has to be critiqued is the notion that I will find freedom or belonging not in the now, but in the what could be, right? Well, if you are, like I think of Dietrich McCloskey in her book Crossing, talking about literally the situation of gender dystopia leading, like dysphoria, leading to a need for a sex train, well, that's an example of the is forcing you into the ought, right? Like that's a place of getting to the place where you literally can't function without the gender reassignment surgery, right? So isness is pushed into that transformation. But that's not from a place of saying, oh, once I become this, then I will find freedom. Because that's where the ought is replacing the is versus the is pushing one to the ought, right? So likewise, that ability to think of how does the state provide spaces where people's isness can push them, or the negativity can push them through the contradiction into what they need to become, that's where it's interesting, because I think basically the problem is like the categories of reformation, reform, conservative, revolution, I don't know, like, and Hegel doesn't fit in all of this in a way, because like his play, to me, the play is he's revolutionary, but he kind of winks and says, that a revolution is a full circle, right? Like a revolution goes in a circle back to where it starts, right? You know that. Like if you want to be revolutionary, you return to where you start. And that's kind of, for me, always the joke. Is Hegel is the only real revolutionist in the sense that he knows that a circle is always returning to the beginning. A full circle is a full revolution, right? So if you want a revolution, you have to be able to be the circle in the circle, right? Well, that's self-reference. The true revolution is a transformation in your self-reference, where you're able to reference yourself as a subject in these new ways. And that ability, that's where then the creativity comes out of that self-reference versus the out there, once I become that, I'll be happy. Oh, once I join that church, once I join that religion, once I have that thing, once I do that, well, then it's not the contradiction pushing you, it's your good ideas getting in the way of the absolute. And so the state has to be in the business of providing the spaces for the contradiction to work people through. But of course, this is radical, and then I'll give it back to you, because the natural experience of abstract freedom is that I ought to turn to the state to release my abstract freedom, to free me of determination, versus I have abstract freedom and conflict of determination. I ought to make sure the state is there not to free me from this tension. I got to make sure the state is not there providing ways for me to get out of suffering that negativity, so I can be worked to the place of the full saturation and then have the threshold, to use Ebert's language, right? That's not natural. You would never think that. Well, this is where the community is big, because the community can teach you that. The state can teach you that, and the key also is this is fundamentally anti-totalitarian. Because you know how Tolstoy once said that every happy family is the same, but every unhappy family is different? Everyone's negativity is one of one. Like leaving people to their negativity cannot be totalitarian, because there's not a single negativity, right? Everyone has their own individual negativity. Likewise, you cannot make a totalitarianism out of a triplex strategy, because every triplex is one of one, right? So this has an anti-authoritarian structure to it, precisely in leaving people in the negative. Here's the irony. When you avoid negativity, then you get authoritarianism. When you accept negativity, you can avoid authoritarianism. It's exactly the opposite of what people think. They turn to the state to release their abstract freedom, which is precisely why the state becomes a terror, as opposed to state, make sure that I am forced to confront my negativity. Don't help me out of this. Just make sure that my negativity is sacred. keep my negativity sacred, separation of church and state. My church is my negativity. The church of the contradiction, as Peter Rollins says. State, your role is to be separate from my church and to protect it and to make sure that we're able to have a society where other churches of contradiction can interact with one another. And I need to go through that. But this is completely unnatural for how the human starts. So you have to have the communities to teach that, to inspire that. And then the other thing, and then I'll give it back to you, is if you have a community of people that you could look to, elders, mentors, and so on, and you look to and say, wow, look how beautiful that person is because they went through the negativity. I want to do that. Like without the community to see what negativity can do, to see what it's like to live a life for ideals that bleed versus ideals that are clean. If you don't see that, it's harder to believe in them. So this is where the communal becomes very important, a community of scars, a community of people that are able to look at one another and say, wow, hard work really pays off. And actually, it's the only thing that pays off. But that is the work of the subject. This is the problem. Most hard work today is hard work in something external. Hard work to petition the state to free you of your abstract tension, to the going to something external. We need the hard work of the subject. So I'm really just taken by this idea of the suffering of the subject, a science of how to suffer subjectively. Because without that, I think it's going to be very difficult to have the state have the role that Hegel is describing to preserve a kind of sacred space of suffering. But I give it back to you.
Well, I know there's this stereotype, for example, of the Protestant work ethic that I always heard, irrespective of the fact that I wasn't raised religious myself. But I at the same time found myself in a working class family where I did see around me the distinction between people who were, let's say, working hard versus succumbing to impulse. And I saw the radical difference in the effects of people who succumbed to impulse versus people who were engaging the long, arduous work and labor. And I saw how quickly someone with an extremely bright future could just absolutely fall off the map, so to speak, just because of an unfortunate fall into a certain type of impulse. So I do think that the real task today is to reestablish, say, a law or a cultural norm which is emphasizing this long, arduous work, and that the only thing that really pays off is the work. And I think that I'm always called back to this line at the end of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where he says, "What matters my happiness? I strive for my work." And this basically is something that also I take close to heart, and Hegel also in the philosophy of right is trying to work through basically a dialectic that brings one from impulse to duty. And he was saying that impulse can become duty. It's almost like if you're working with that impulse itself, it can become a duty that you enjoy. And he said, well, what are the conditions of possibility to find happiness in duty as opposed to happiness in impulse? And he said that it's actually, you have to find a universe. It's a paradoxical thing where you have to find a universality that is above all particulars, but at the same time that universality becomes a self-relating universality, which then again becomes particular. And I think I think this is really important, because in that paradoxical movement, you have to let go of your big ideas of universality for them to become more and more singular to you. And that singularity, Hegel's saying, actually manifests in that line that have been mentioning a few times today already: family, community, and state. And so if you have this disposition where a particular individual is demanding the universality of the state, what it ought to do, and how it should relieve me of my suffering and my negativity, this is precisely that this subject needs to be turned inside out, so to speak. It's the wrong disposition on the side of the subject that the solution of the state is that it should provide the individual of what it immediately demands. The role of the state is precisely to keep that gap between the subject and its demands, so that you might figure out what you might become of universality in your particularity. And that's only going to come through the suffering of negativity, as you say. Now, to state this positively, which I think is interesting to state this positively, is that I think it's correct to say that for Hegel, belonging is freedom. that we never have belonging in some sort of a priori relationship to a set of givens, that actually the human being paradoxically finds belonging in freedom, which only appears as a result of an arduous labor and negativity. So it's really a paradoxical. We're really a strange being, basically, and if we don't understand that the nature of that strange being, then we're going to set ourselves up for political disasters. Now, that move to find belonging in freedom is a move where we go from natural will to spiritual will, where we have to see our natural will as not. I mean, yeah, okay, we can call our natural will sinful. We can call our natural will evil, but at the same time, the paradox is we have to work with that sin. We have to work with that evil in our own heart, and we can't pretend that we're somehow above it, especially that we're somehow above it just through our own bright ideas. That's really the crucial mistake. So we have to recognize, okay, my natural will, we can say in a religious language, is sinful. We could say my natural will in a more secular language is impulsive and leading to potentially my unfreedom. And at the same time, I have to work with that material, so to speak, if I'm to really find my spiritual will, if I'm to really find my belonging in spiritual freedom. And I think, again, to reference what's going on there is a movement from the immediacy of the circle to the circle of circles. I want to just emphasize that when you're linking the real revolution, and Hegel is a revolutionary thinker, to this circle of circles, that this circle of circles is different from, I think, what I would call the pre-modern circle, in the sense that the pre-modern circle, it seems to me, is suggesting a type of repetition of the same, whereas the circle of circles is very, very strange. I just want to emphasize how strange the circle of circles is, especially as it relates to spiritual freedom, because the circle of circles, if you go on the journey, it's true that you go on a journey to back where you started, but at the same time, the journey is necessary, and the journey of returning is necessary, and even stranger, that the beginning where you start, the beginning where you start again, is new and never existed before. So it's a very strange thing. But where it takes us, I think, and here to use your language, it takes us from I would call it more of a classical or non-dialectical notion of belonging to a belonging again and again and again and again. And so again, this belonging again, and I would link belonging again and again and again to spiritual freedom. Absolutely. And that spiritual freedom is actually the domain of the new and creativity. And that brings me to what we were discussing in the portal to start this month at the portal. We're discussing home and origin. And one of the things that I wanted to bring to that conversation is the difference between conceiving of home and origin as some stability in the past versus thinking home and origin as something that's dynamically creative in the now. So this dynamical creativity in the now, and that's sort of where I've been trying to work out, is home is where my creativity is. But that doesn't mean that creativity is a stability. It means that my home is, in some sense, a little bit disruptive and dynamic, and that I've become sort of more and more comfortable with the discomfort, so to speak, and that creativity needs to be walked in the contradiction of the biological and the cultural, in the sense that the biological creativity is the ground of the family, creating a family. You're creating potentially a child. And also the cultural creativity, which is the art and the philosophy and the music and the music of life and the art of life. And I think that's really the stakes of, at least for me, like this is the stakes of my philosophy and my drive, and I'd say it's the stakes of our work in the broader liminal web space, is to make this contradiction of creativity more conscious. The contradiction of creativity that human beings uniquely have, which is between the cultural and the biological, because the animals just have the creativity of the biological. They can, and what I mean by that is that they can just recreate their bodies through sexual reproduction or asexual reproduction. But we can have the culture, and then traditionally speaking, I think traditional cultures which are mediating the reproduction of the biological seem to present an incredible tension with cultural creativity. And usually you do have these generational rifts that open up between the biological and the cultural creativity, because the cultural creativity opens us to a radical difference. And again, emphasizing that this circle of circles is not a circle of just self-similarity. It's a circle of circles with a radical difference, which is disruptive, and which brings us to this, I think, difference between, again, belonging versus belonging again and again and again, to link it to your work. And so, you know, ultimately here, I'll just say that the political stakes of Hegel's philosophy, I do think I'm just stumbling because I'm wondering if I'm making too strong a discontinuity between traditional pre-modern thought and Hegelian thought. But I am tempted to say that Hegelian thought is introducing this. This is a new introduction, but this is something the traditional world either struggled to think or could not think. And that Hegel here is identifying something which is a constitutive feature of modernity, which we have yet to resolve on the level of self-reflection, and that this is evident in our politics, that we have not resolved it.
Magnificent. I think there is something new. I think there is an idea that there is something in the pre-modern that must be kept sublated, but the different quality, I think basically the 19th century, you know, between 1801 and 1899 is where a whole lot of stuff happened that we still haven't fully fledged out or thought, because it is the introduction of the great enrichment, really trade routes, Dutch Empire, pluralism, and really there's this, because it's one thing to talk about self-reflection not in the presence of the different other, and to talk about self-reflection in their presence. And that transforms everything. And basically the pre-modern could engage in self-reflection without it having to go be a kind of return that changes everything. Because really, if you are born in Christianity and you only ever interact with Christianity, there's a real sense that if you return home, it probably is pretty similar, because there's not that much transformation or encountering with difference, right? There is still a degree that you can never go home. The return is always an RE in parentheses, but it's probably closer to the non-parentheses return than not. But today, where you're increasingly encountering difference, many ideas, modern state, there's a hard separation between your work life and your home life. You're increasingly working things that you don't own, private property. There is increasingly a kind of presence of an otherness that transforms. Once you encounter that otherness and you return home, there's a big difference that's going on. And I think that's what Hegel is understanding, that he's thinking. And how do you find freedom in when the thing that you're in is changing under your feet, or you can't identify it, or it's transformed? This is very different. Like it's one thing if you're a Christian and your parents are Christian, you leave and come home and you're Christian, to find belonging there, pretty natural, not that much has changed. But if your parents are Christian, you go off and maybe you just become a Catholic or a Protestant instead of a Protestant, you come home, you can feel alienated there because there's a difference that has emerged. How do you find freedom in that? And how are you glad for the negativity that now emerges because of that difference? How do you get glad for the ways that pluralism has made you complex and alien to the people around you? How do you become glad for alienness? Well, that's a very different role of the state now. Versus to defend you from the other, how do you become glad for the other? And I think Hegel understood that process of becoming alien had to be something that the state had to somehow get in the business of making you glad for, you know, to find freedom and belonging in that alienation, becoming alien. Like, how do you find belonging in alienation? You know, that how could you even be happy for alienation? Isn't belonging and alienation opposites? Yeah. But there's a way in which alienation makes making alien, alienation. There's a way in which that, as being possible in the modern world, allows a kind of spiritual belonging that arguably was not possible in the past. Like spiritual belonging in the past had a very different quality than what it would mean to have a spiritual belonging, a spiritual freedom in the context of pluralism. And that's what I think we have to think now that's very difficult. A few more things. I think the connection of belonging is absolutely tied to freedom in, not just freedom from and freedom with. It's this notion of belonging again and again and again and again. And it's this ability of finding freedom in your determinations, of which there's a split between your abstract freedom and what is, and how do you be grateful for that split? How do you be grateful for the fact that you can never return? And yet you do return, and yet it's not the same. And I think also what that unveils, that requires otherness to experience, is that origin requires origination. You have to create. This is what's weird. Like, origin only exists to the degree that you are actively originating, which means creating, originating, right? If you're not creating, let's put it this way, you may have a biological origin, but you don't have a spiritual origin, because the spirit, to use in the Hegelian sense, requires the creative act, this creative work, right? So if you're not creating, well, then you don't have an origin for your spirit, because it's not there. You don't have a spirit. So there is no origin for the spirit. You have a biological origin, but you only have a spiritual origin, which is the human origin. That's like the only human origin in a way, or the distinct human quality. You only have that to the degree that you are originating, right? That you are creating. All creativity, in a way, if we mean it in this deeper Hegelian sense, is creating with the split between the abstract freedom and determination. You are creating with that. That is your material. Spirit is working with that split, with that contradiction. And you only have a spiritual origin to the degree you are originating with that. Otherwise, you don't have an origin. You don't have of course you don't have belonging, because you don't have an origin. You might have a biological belonging, but you see, the funny thing is everyone knows that biological belonging is pretty cheap and doesn't really mean much. Like, okay, I'm from here, but I feel like everyone hates me here, or no one knows me and I don't feel cherished. Okay, well, who cares, right? Like, it's, as we talked about the difference between cheap to lose and costly to lose, it's almost like you have cheap origin and costly origin, cheap home and costly home, cheap spit, that's the issue. And really, in order for us to really feel like we have an origin, we have to feel like we have a story. And a story requires tension, theme, and that kind of contradiction, right? Like if I were to ask you, what is the origin of Frodo or something in Lord of the Rings? We don't tend to associate it with his birth. The only reason like Frodo has an origin that you even bother to talk about is because he's situated in the story of the Fellowship, the Lord of the Rings, right? Because there is a story and originating, a creativity, then it's meaningful to describe the origin of Frodo. But let's theoretically imagine that Frodo never participated in the Lord of the Rings story. Would you even bother to talk about the origin of Frodo? You wouldn't even think about him, right? The meaningfulness of the origin as a concept emerges from the story, right? And there's something about story and spirit for the human that are always tied together. It's hard to imagine a spirit without story, if we're alluding it to the Andrew Luber and Alex kind of thematic model, this notion of a theme. And the theme is the command that you must figure out how to reconcile abstract freedom with determination. The theme, and theme is command in their work. Like, what is the command upon you? The command is that you must find freedom in determination. You must find belonging again and again and again and again and again in this ever-changing determination and becoming, right? This is your command. But what we tend to naturally do is think our command is we must overcome determination. We must overcome the things we find ourselves in with freedom. And actually, most stories begin in irony, where you are misinterpreting what the theme is. You think that what you're supposed to do is overcome your determination with abstract freedom. No, that's the irony. The story begins when you're aware of the irony, as Andrew and Alex talk. Once you become aware of the irony, which is, oh my gosh, I've been spending my entire life thinking that what I need to do is be free from determination. No, what I've got to do is learn to find freedom in determination. That moment is kind of your origin. That moment of realizing the story from the irony, that's the origin. And now you have that origin in the spiritual sense to the degree that you continue to originate and work and create that story of working and responding to the theme of you must find your freedom in determination is what we mean by belonging. Like, be in the longing, be in this contradiction that you're working through. And then Hegel is asking, what does a politics look like that is about that? What does a politics look like that is about living with that command, that theme, that abstract freedom in the contradiction with determinism, a politics of belonging versus a politics of freedom over determination? Because basically through most of history, politics has been about freedom from determination, getting over restriction, getting over limit. Hegel's like, no, what would a politics look like that finds freedom in limitation and determination? What would that look like? That's a very different politics. And that's not really what we thought. And again, and then I'll give it to you here, I just am of the opinion that a lot of the thinking of the 18th century, the 19th century, this period has not really been taken seriously because it was too hard in a way. It was too difficult. Like it's demanding too much of us in a way. But then the way I've just been thinking it more and more about it, that contradiction of the unaddressed 19th century is bursting forth now. Like that, the unaddressed Hegel, the unaddressed, I talk about how we've never in a sense really done sociology. We've never really taken economics seriously. These things are now bursting forth because you're at the point where you can't deny it anymore. And thus the isness is forcing you to think it as opposed to your good ideas, but you have to tarry with the negativity. The secret is the negativity is the only place of the triplex. It's the only place where beauty can bleed. So you have to be in the now. Otherwise, you cannot belong again and again and again and again. You can only do some sort of abstract freedom or some sort of nostalgia that is running from the problem versus facing the problem, which then a life of really emphasizing hard work can help with and seeing actually freedom in that work.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot there to digest, but I just want to maybe center it around the meta frame of Philosophy Portal has been this, let's say, making sense of the 19th century gesture of Hegel's philosophical work, and that what's at stake there is, I think, not only active, but probably radioactive in regards to contemporary political conversations as about the movement, which is more normative, which is Hegel to Marx, versus the movement from Marx to Hegel, this retroactive notion that we find in Žižek's work. And I think what's quite remarkable on some level, and maybe in the context of the entire sort of philosophical journey that not only I'm on, but that I'm trying to help facilitate in collaboration with other philosophical entities, is that not only have we not reconciled with these great 19th century thinkers, but as a consequence, I don't think we've been giving birth to philosophers. And I think that what the complexity and the negativities of our present moment are demanding of us is actually that we need to give birth to philosophical cognition. And I think that's actually the main difference. Like, now that I'm thinking about it a little deeper, I think that's the main difference between Plato and Hegel, is that I think in studying Plato, you might be able to inhabit the traditional world and the tradition and cultivate a traditional notion of belonging. But I'm not so sure if staying with, I think the stakes of moving from Plato to Hegel is moving from the question of, can I identify with this given philosophy versus can I birth myself as philosopher? And I think that's maybe also the performative contradiction in some 20th century philosophy, is that it's not really understanding this move sufficiently enough, that just really the stakes is that philosophical cognition embedded in the world is now necessary. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean that we've just read all the books of philosophy that have existed, but it's more cultivating a certain way of being, a certain way of being and a way of living, which does involve, to my mind, more reflectively walking this contradiction of creativity between the biological and the cultural. So hopefully that's what the result of this work will be, because if we don't learn how to talk about politics on the scale and the level I think that Hegel's introducing, again, from the immediate will to the interrelations between states, then I think the consequences for our concrete lives is that these two forms of creativity will become separated. We'll either become cultural creatives that can't reproduce biologically, or we'll be able to reproduce biologically, but we won't be able to engage in cultural creativity. And so ultimately we get, to use your language, a cheap form of cultural creativity or a cheap form of biological creativity, as opposed to a costly form of biocultural creativity. And maybe just a final thought on, it's a little bit disconnected from the philosophy of right, but a little bit of thought on, you know, this idea of the origin as at first thought of as freedom from determination, but actually we don't our story doesn't start until we're looking for freedom in determination, is that I think the way I explored this in my 20s, and I think maybe the way in which many scientific thinkers are exploring this, is through the technological singularity as freedom from determination. And what I mean by that is technological singularity as freedom from determination is that freedom is located in the future, and freedom is located in the future that's transcended all determinations. And so the subtitle, for example, of Ray Kurzweil's book, The Singularity is Near, is When Humans Transcend Biology. So then there's if you transcend biology, well, then you don't need to deal with the contradiction of creativity between the biological and the cultural. And you don't need to deal with the politics of family. And you don't need to deal with the politics of community and the state, because you've transcended all of that because you don't have a body anymore. And if there's not a body anymore, then wherever action is happening, it's not in the concrete embodied context that we've come to know and think in history. And maybe that is the future, who the hell knows? But the point is, for the now of our current moment, we do have bodies. We are walking the line between biocultural creativity, and these things do need to be thought, and these things can fall apart if we're not committed to thinking it. So ultimately, that it's in that precise distinction, to bring it back around to maybe the philosophy of right and the work at Philosophy Portal. It's in precisely that movement of freedom from determination to freedom in determination where I started to need philosophy, and where I situate sort of the telos of Philosophy Portal and the logic of its courses. So yeah, just as a final note on that, here the philosophy of right is something that's trying to help us think on the level of political universality, and that if we don't think on the level of political universality, I think again the stakes of this cultural contradiction will be lost.
Extraordinary. And I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I appreciate your time as we come up on the close here. Thank you, as always, Cadell. I completely agree that some sort of philosophical consciousness is necessary today. Otherwise, we'll continue to sink into various pathologies, global problems, and so on and so forth. Also, it would seem that a politics focused on the question of a costly biocultural, to make possible a costly biocultural, that's the name of the game, basically. And a politics that encourages and incubates philosophical consciousness, if we use that term, is the name of the game. Without that, it does not seem possible to belong again at scale without regressing. And if we regress, then we're effaced. So the consequences are quite high. I agree with this idea of, like, we can't have freedom be in the future, away from biology, if you will. Who knows? Maybe one day, like, Hegel wouldn't say that's impossible, but it's not now. It's not frickin' now. So think the now. Otherwise, you're just, it's like the third impact in Neon Genesis Evangelion, just a blob kind of thing. We have to be careful that we don't find freedom in a blob, as we're talking about, or a doll, as Owen was talking about. That made me think about Ghost in the Shell, to get my anime love out. So I think also I really like this point on the idea that we've identified with a philosophy versus figure out the process of birthing self as a philosopher. I think that's a huge difference. And really, I think it's very clear that most 20th century philosophy has really kind of given up on that. It's really become Richard Rorty. Not that I have anything against forms of neo-pragmatism or Peirce or different things, but that's not the same. Now, I think it's funny that the end of 20th century philosophy brings up so much pragmatism, because it's almost like there's a subconscious realization of the primacy of the actual. But it's not been able to do that. It's needed Hegel, in my opinion, to really take that to the right direction. I think the counter-enlightenment thinkers, I emphasize, got that as well. But you have to bring in the subject. And the moment you bring in the subject, you're thinking ideas. And if you're thinking ideas, then the question is how, and then, you know, we go from there. So I think a political universality of a costly biocultural that is training people to find freedom in isness, and to understand, though, that that isness is creative, that it is not stagnant, that there is a creativity in the isness that is unfolding with time in our identification with it. And I think what I would say to give to you, because I would ask you how people can sign up for the course, when it starts, and things of that nature. I'm looking forward to being part of it. Every class has been a complete treat, and learned a lot from it. I think I would definitely say that one of the things that philosophical consciousness does is help you to actually believe that what ought to be is what is, and to see the beauty in that, and that has practical implications for how you live, and it has impacts on how you relate to people and the world. And that is something that is found in the training of philosophy. But it requires the right kind of philosophy. It has to be a place that is trying to birth philosophers versus simply identify with philosophical schools. And that is what Philosophy Portal is in the business of. And so I appreciate your work. So when can they sign up for the course? When will it be starting, my dear friend?
Yeah, so thanks so much for this conversation. It's been as I presupposed, it's a great it's been a great motivation for me to approach how I'm going to frame the book and how I'm going to teach the book. The course starts May 18th. The course will run throughout May and June. And of course, there'll be post-course processes after that, which we'll figure out as a class for those of you, for those who are interested in signing up. There are going to be 6 classes, so it's not a overly demanding, it's not an overly time-consuming class, but it will be covering every section of the philosophy right in detail. That's been sort of the principle of Philosophy Portal, is that we commit to and remain organized towards long-form conceptual mediation. We want to read books in their totality. We want to read books in great detail. And also there will be exegetical reading spaces led by Dimitri Kroimans, who's been a student and a teaching assistant at Philosophy Portal for over 2 years now. So there will also be spaces where you can engage in more direct reading of the text with Dimitri. And of course, just want to emphasize that this is more than a course, in a sense of, if you're someone who is interested in learning and experimenting with presenting your own philosophical ideas, if you're someone who's interested in building your own philosophical writing style and engagement with the history of philosophy, this is also a great container to get experience in that direction, and also embed yourself into a community mind that will read and engage with your work in the longer term. There are people who have been working and writing at Philosophy Portal for over 2.5 years now. I would say we have an emerging library. We have an emerging archive of great texts. And so this course is aiming to be a part of that tradition, and you can very much become a part of that tradition. If you get involved, it's not too late. You haven't missed the bus. You haven't missed the proverbial train. In some sense, we are all collectively recreating the origin of what this process is as we go. And so if you want to get involved, philosophyportal.online, or you can email me at cadell.last@gmail.com, and I'll try to be as responsive as possible.
Magnificent. And I cannot suggest it enough. Everyone should sign up. The classes have been tremendous. The conferences have been tremendous. The writing has been tremendous. The community has been tremendous. And I cannot suggest enough that people sign up. And I've certainly been blessed by it. Cadell Last, it is always a pleasure to speak with you, sir. All the best. Thank you, sir. All the best.